Well, the Victorian state government, led by Premier Dan Andrews, is sitting on 2 independent investigations into its COVID lockdowns, which were some of the harshest in the world. And the government won't release these reports until after the state election in November. If those reports gave the state government a comprehensive tick of approval, you can guarantee they'd be centre stage throughout the next 2 months of the election campaign. The fact that they are being hidden, therefore, makes you wonder what damning information and conclusions they contain. Well, wonder no more, because the Institute of Public Affairs has also done 2 reports into the lockdown, and they were released to the public last week. To quote from one of them, quote, "This report demonstrates that far more years of life will be lost due to the restrictions than have been saved." Unquote. In other words, Dan Andrews' government's harsh, authoritarian policies did more harm than good. Let's get the Executive Director of the IPA, Scott Hargreaves, in to talk about these reports. Scott, welcome.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you for having me on the program.
Pleasure. Scott, the first of these reports, titled Hard Lessons, says that Australia suffered a net economic loss of $260 billion between March 2020 and June 2022. Of this, $111 billion, or almost half, was suffered in Victoria alone. I think it's fair to say that the harsher the lockdown, the worse the net suffering by citizens. Is that right?
Well, that's exactly right, Fred. It's an indictment on governments around Australia that not only did they not ever conduct a cost-benefit analysis before they implemented lockdowns, they haven't done it afterwards. They're not really interested in a reckoning of the cost it imposed on the community. And in Victoria, those costs are disproportionately large. As you say, the lockdowns here encompass more of the activity of everyday life, more economic activity. The guys from Jim's Mowing weren't even allowed to fulfil their contracts to mow the lawns of little old ladies outside, even though government contractors were. And of course, the lockdowns lasted longer. So that's why the IPA did do the cost-benefit analysis that governments won't, and also why we found that Victoria's share of that total loss was actually much greater than it should have been.
Well, speaking of that, it's difficult to recall now because the last 2 years have this kind of weird, hazy memory to them. But it's difficult to recall now why some states suffered more than others. Was Victoria's lockdown anything to do with the virus, or was it simply because the Andrews government was more inclined to be oppressive and dictatorial?
An interesting question, Fred. Just last week, we had at an IPA event in Melbourne, Professor Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford University, very much a professional in the field. And as he said, at the time, governments had choices. We saw Sweden, for instance, made very different choices. Our official pandemic plans all had a variant of what was called focused protection. Let's look after the most vulnerable in our community. But instead, our governments made different choices. They seemed to be inspired not by what was in their own pandemic management plans, but by what they'd seen on TV that was taking place in China, where lockdowns had been the tool of choice for governments. And it did seem that in Victoria in particular, that was the one tool that the government seemed to be interested in, to the exclusion of all others.